is that? What is that? Hello? The time is now 5:30 p.m. on November 20th. Is that you? 2019. And this public meeting of the State Board of Education will come to order. The roll will now be called to determine the presence of a quorum. Mr. Hayworth, please call the roll.
Dr. Gasoi. Dr. Gasoi.
Present.
Mr. Jacobson.
Present.
President Wattenberg.
Present.
Dr. O'Leary.
Present.
Mr. Parker.
Present.
Dr. Sutter.
Present.
Ms. Williams.
Present.
Mr. Batchelor.
Present.
Ms. Macleay.
Present.
Ms. Burton.
Present.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Present.
Madam President, we have a full house.
Great. A quorum has been determined, and the State Board will proceed now with the business portion of the meeting. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. Are there any corrections or additions? Okay, seeing no changes, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
The motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? The motion is approved. We also have before us the minutes from our November 6th working session. Any corrections or additions to those minutes? Seeing no changes, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays.
You only got a motion.
Oh, second?
Second.
Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion is approved. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ruth Wattenberg. I'm the Ward 3 representative on the DC State Board of Education, and I'm the president of the board. On behalf of the members of the District of Columbia State Board of Ed, I want to welcome all of you and our viewing public to our Wednesday, November 20th public meeting. The State Board holds its regularly scheduled meeting on the third Wednesday of every month here at the Old Council Chambers at 441 4th Street Northwest. The meeting is broadcast live via District Knowledge Network, and it also live streams via Periscope on Twitter. The video for the meeting will be posted on our YouTube page at DC SBOE as soon as it's available. Our next official meeting of the State Board is our working session on December 4th, held here at 1 Judiciary Square and broadcast on Periscope. We will begin our meeting tonight with a ceremonial resolution. The State Board uses ceremonial resolutions to recognize organizations or individuals in the district. The Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy uses baseball and softball as vehicles to foster positive character development, academic achievement, and improved health among young people from underserved communities. The Academy provides academic support, food education, and community services to families across Wards 7 and 8. Tonight, we will also be hearing from district social studies teachers and curriculum directors. The board began a process earlier this year to review the social studies standards and determine what revisions are needed to bring them up to date. I want to thank Dr. Jessica Sutter, our Ward 6 representative, for chairing the Social Studies Standards Committee and for organizing tonight's discussion, as well as talking with representatives from DCPS, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, and the Public Charter School Board about undertaking these revisions and getting this process going. I want to say one thing about this. Regular reviews of education standards are so important. They provide the framework for DC schools in both sectors to select curriculum that suits their students. In the district, statewide education standards are developed in a joint process between the board and the Office of the State Superintendent. They are then proposed by OSSE and must be approved by the State Board. I want to make one important point here. Unlike in other states, the district does not have a formal review statute that requires regular review of our academic standards. Many of our standards are nearly a decade old, including world languages, adopted in 2008, arts education, adopted in 2008, embedded technology standards, adopted in 2009, and of course, social studies, adopted in 2007. The State Board has requested in its fiscal year 2021 budget support for a staff position that would support regular updates and reviews of these standards. Let me also say only 5 states have social studies standards more outdated than the district at this point. The board will be also considering 2 reports tonight. One, an adoption of the report from the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education. The Ombudsman's Office is an independent, neutral resource for district families that utilizes mediation and conflict resolution services to resolve complaints and concerns related to public education. This year's annual report makes 3 recommendations: develop a citywide framework for response to intervention, set guidelines for how the manifestation determination review must be conducted, and require schools to maintain a published list of the special education services that the school has accommodated for the past 3 years. Many thanks to our Ombudsman, Serena Hayes, her staff, Ravel Fitzpatrick and Stephanie Arias, and the office's fellows for their dedication and compassion. If you have a complaint or a concern related to public education, you can reach the Office of the Ombudsman by calling 202-741-0886 or emailing education.ombudsman@dc.gov. The second annual report is from the Office of the Student Advocate, which provides support for students and families through training programs and research support designed to amplify the voice of families and support them through the education system. I want to thank Chief Student Advocate Dan Davis, his staff Philip Copeland and Renata Landro, and their fellows for their deep commitment to district residents. If you're interested in learning more about the opportunities provided by the Office of the Student Advocate, you can reach them by calling 202-741-4692 or emailing student.advocate@dc.gov. The full text of both reports can be found on the State Board's website. I look forward to working with the Ombudsman and the Chief Student Advocate and the Board to advance the recommendations that fall under the State Board's authority. I want to acknowledge the members of our audience who are here tonight related to youth anti-smoking. Nearly 2,500 children under the age of 18 try their first cigarette every day. We can and must do more to keep tobacco products out of the hands of children. Thank you all very much for being here. Finally, I want to note for the audience here and at home that the Council Committee on Education, chaired by David Grosso, and the Committee of the Whole, chaired by Philip Mendelson, are holding a number of hearings in the next few weeks that are related to education in DC. On November 22nd, there is a hearing on academic achievement. On December 4th will be teacher retention. December 5th will be school attendance, and December 18th will be on the Master Facilities Plan. I encourage the public to learn more about these hearings on the DC Council website. Normally, this is the time we would hear from our state superintendent. She is unable to join us tonight, and so we're going to move straight to ceremonial resolutions. Our first resolution is CR 1921, recognizing the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy. Is there a motion on the resolution?
I'd like to move it, but I'd also like to move it as the former baseball coach at Cardozo High School for 40 years. And so I was there before there was any kind of an academy and during the whole time, and it was just fabulous. And it's been a big bonus for all of the baseball players in the city.
Second.
Thank you. The motion has been made by Coach O'Leary and seconded by, maybe he's a Coach Parker, I don't know. Mr. Hayworth, could you please read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education Ceremonial Resolution recognizing the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy, CR 19-21. Whereas the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy is a nonprofit organization using baseball and softball to foster positive character development, academic achievement, and improved health among youth from underserved communities in the District of Columbia. Whereas the vision of the Academy, located in the Fort DuPont community in Ward 7, is to nurture the development of youth into thriving members and leaders of the community. Whereas the Academy currently serves approximately 1,000 children between the ages of 6 and 14. Whereas the Academy provides a number of academic supports, including mentorship, STEM education, and literacy education, in addition to its baseball and softball programs. Whereas the Academy is specifically focused on serving communities east of the Anacostia River, and its programs take a community-centered approach to improving public health. And whereas the Academy promotes the values of persistence, grit, energy, and a commitment to physical fitness and well-being in the youth they serve. Now therefore, be it resolved, on the occasion of the Washington Nationals 2019 World Series title, the DC State Board of Education celebrates the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy and its commitment to the youth of the District of Columbia. Be it further resolved that the State Board recognizes the Academy's valuable work in providing academic and physical education programming to youth in Wards 7 and 8.
Thank you. Is there discussion on the resolution? Mr. Batchelor?
Madam President, thanks to my colleagues for recognizing this amazing organization that's doing so much great work for our young people, especially east of the Anacostia River. I got an opportunity to visit the Youth Academy earlier this year for the first time with Executive Director Cartland, who's here, and thank you so much for the work you do to really make that a hub for so many supports and resources and fun for our neighbors. And it was an amazing experience. And we've got a lot to be proud of for our nationals, and we didn't want to let this moment in our history go by without also celebrating the wins that you produce at your facility every day of the year for our young people. So thank you so much.
Any other discussion? None from the coach. Okay. Seeing no further discussion, the motion is on adoption. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion carries. And I think we're going to recess for a few minutes to present the resolution to the Academy's Executive Director, Jennifer Cartland. We'll be right back.
I don't have any lipstick on. I think it's okay, though, right? Yeah, there you go.
Malaya, do you want to use my phone or? Okay. Remember that we come down this way? Can you move the stickers to the side just or underneath the jacket?
First Amendment, man. I explain.
Which stickers?
All of them.
Wow.
It's not a competition. I just win.
Because the last one didn't have the student members in it.
Oh, right. Good point, good point.
This is going to be the one that ends up at the top of the line.
Did it look good?
Yeah.
Can I see? What happened to the other two pictures that we did? Oh, that's good. I'm very blessed.
Okay, the meeting of the State Board. The meeting of the State Board will come back to order. The State Board welcomes public participation in activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. Your comments will become part of our official record. If you're a member of the public and would like to speak at a future public meeting, please contact our staff by email at sboe@dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Tonight we have 3 public witnesses. If witnesses have provided written comments for the record, they are available on our website. As I call your name, please come down to the table. Laura Fuchs, Chair of Washington Teachers Union COPE, Michael Brown, Senator from DC, and Stuart Berlow, American Heart Association. No mic. You each have 3 minutes to speak this evening. Please note that you must use your mic. Your mic is already on. The light on the table will be green for the first 2.5 minutes. It will turn yellow for the last 30, and it will turn red after 3 minutes have elapsed. Please begin when you're ready. We'll start with you.
Good evening. On behalf of the American Heart Association, the entire Flavors Hook Kids DC Coalition, and so many incredible students who've joined us today, first we want to thank the board for the support you have provided to end the vaping and e-cigarette epidemic facing the district and our country. These great students came today to show their support, and we strongly encourage the board at your December meeting to adopt Resolution 1913 on protecting our kids from big tobacco. And I would add on protecting our kids from big tobacco and big vape, because it's one and the same. I provided you all with our written testimony. I don't want to go through all of the statistics. I think many of you know what truly a crisis we are facing in this country. This is unprecedented in our history to see an increase in use of any substance that we have seen with e-cigarettes. Over 100% increase in teens who are using e-cigarettes. Around the country, over 5 million kids are vaping right now. It's just extraordinary. Almost every child who is using e-cigarettes, 97% the research tells us, are using flavor products, and about 70% are telling us the reason that they are using these products is because of the flavors. Flavors like mango and bubble gum and cotton candy. It's hard to say that these are not designed to entice kids. The evidence is clear, as I've indicated in my testimony, that the evidence is showing us that kids are starting to vape and then transition on to combustible cigarettes. We're even hearing stories now that kids are so addicted to the nicotine in e-cigarettes that they're starting to use regular cigarettes as a means of trying to quit using the e-cigarettes. And this vicious cycle is being created. Again, this is a problem we're seeing not just here in the district, around the country. And the district has always been a leader in tobacco control, as you all know. We have some of the strongest tobacco control policies in the country. We've always been a leader, and it will send such a strong signal to our community and the nation as a whole if the board will take action to encourage the council to take further action to restrict the sale of all flavored tobacco products. So what we know is it's not just the e-cigarettes that are part of this problem. It is all flavored tobacco products, including menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. So we want to make sure that that is clear, that we're talking about more than just the e-cigarettes. So again, I want to thank the board for the support you've shown in the past, and we hope in the future to really end this crisis, and it truly is a crisis. As I said, the amount of the increase that we are seeing in youth vaping is truly extraordinary. The addiction is something we've never seen before, and it is reversing decades of progress in ending smoking among youth. Now, all those declines we're seeing rise up again in an unprecedented way. So again, we want to thank you for your support, encourage you all to support the resolution at the December meeting, and we encourage you to support further efforts across the district to end youth tobacco use.
Thank you very much. We'll come back and possibly have some questions. Laura Fuchs, WTU. And I want to acknowledge that Senator Michael Brown has entered the room, and you're going to go right after Laura.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, so I'm here to give some thoughts on the social studies standards. I've been a social studies teacher in DC Public Schools since 2007. And I also served on the DC State Board of Education's Credit Flexibility Task Force back when that was a thing. So I just have a couple of things to think about, or maybe principles that I hope will get taken into account as you're just beginning this exploration and change. So one, please don't attempt to wholly make the social studies standards flexible or optional. Unfortunately, in the system of limited time and resources that we are in, too often something that is deemed flexible is something that gets cut, minimized, or swept to the side for schools serving students with the greatest needs, especially east of the river. This is especially important for DC history half credit and the 2 years of world history that are required to graduate. I personally applaud DC's commitment to 2 years of world history and think that it should be continued. For many of our students, these 2 years will be the last that they spend on international studies and world history. And I think we need to give students as great an exposure to the world around them as possible in preparing them to be global citizens. And moving it to area studies could reduce the focus on certain continent areas that I think often just get shortchanged in general and are currently shortchanged in our standards. Number two would be that we not move towards a system of standards that allow for greater standardized testing in the social studies. Part of the beauty of social studies is how gigantic and complex a series of courses we can teach are available. This really provides opportunities for teachers to specialize, give students a chance to dive deep, and get a huge array of content. Social studies beauty is the ability of teachers to specialize within a reasonable framework of standards. Standardized tests usually turn social studies into vocabulary mastery and memorization course, even with exams that are deemed better, like advanced placement, which I've taught for the past 8 years. And it often, again, robs students in schools east of the river of chances to do big projects, more creative interactions with the material in an attempt to pass the test when we move towards kind of drill and kill to try to beat the exam. And so while the exams are important, I want to shy away from that kind of set of standards. Then, as it sounds like we will be doing, including as many voices as possible. DC's current social studies standards, as I understand it, I wasn't here, but I came in right after they were passed, so I met lots of people who were part of the process. The way they talked about it was very inclusive and very committee-oriented. That, of course, creates kind of a vast and maybe sometimes alarming number of standards for some of the courses, but there is kind of a beauty in that because I learned a whole lot even just reading the standards of the kinds of things I should be covering in my course, and while I can't go in-depth on every single one as much as I might love to, it really just gives like a wide array of things that I know I was not taught in high school. And so I think there is a lot of good there, even with a lot of the things that maybe we want to adjust. And Latin America in particular should be looked at, especially in World II. It's a huge problem. There's not nearly enough information on Latin America in our standards, and I think, you know, to reflect our students, as well as just a huge important part of the U.S.'s relation with the world, which is mostly in Latin America, or well, not mostly, but largely in Latin America, it should probably reflect a greater portion of the World II standards. And lastly, textbooks companies are garbage. We should not force our standards to comply with their garbage marketing and materials. So, no to textbook companies.
Thank you. Senator?
Thank you. I would first like to thank the board for allowing me to breeze in and breeze out here and make a brief statement. The reason I'm here tonight is because I got an email 2 days ago saying that this meeting was going to be convened and that you were going to talk about social studies standards. And I am on my way to the National Conference of Social Studies, National Council of Social Studies for the fourth time to present on DC statehood. We've developed a website to teach kids all across the country about DC statehood as part of their civil rights curriculum, as part of their social studies curriculum. And, you know, it occurred to me that since I put 3 children through DC public schools from pre-K through high school, one of whom just graduated 3 years ago, they didn't know very much about DC statehood. So I'm here to encourage the board, as you consider new standards, to consider taking a look at what we're doing to teach kids about statehood. You know, this is a struggle that they should know about. Nobody should graduate from high school in the District of Columbia without having a full understanding of what the violation of their rights really means. And, you know, we have an opportunity here because you can not only teach your kids about Brown versus Board of Education. You can take them down to the Supreme Court. You can tell them that a Washingtonian was actually one of the plaintiffs. You can take them out onto the mall. And best of all, we could take them up to Capitol Hill to lobby with us. And we've done that in the past. And I'll tell you, I don't think a kid will remember very much what the week he spent on the Louisiana Purchase. But you take him around to a couple of congressional offices, and that'll leave an impression with him. And experiential learning is really, really the best way to teach. So we have an opportunity here, but we also have an obligation, because ignorance is the enabler of injustice. If you don't know you're being taken advantage of, well, it's easy to take advantage of you. So we have an opportunity to teach them in a way that they may not be able to learn other subjects just because of our locale. And we have an obligation to them when they leave, so that they understand what it means not to have voting representation in Congress. So thanks so much for giving me this time. And if you're in Austin over the weekend, stop in. They're going to live stream our presentation for the first time. So social studies classes all over the country will see it. Yeah. So thanks again. Thanks so much. So I know so many of you, and you're such wonderful people. Thanks for for what you do.
Thank you for coming. Will you stay for a moment while we just run through a round of
Yeah,
questions
yeah,
in case somebody
absolutely.
has one for you?
Yeah.
Okay, questions? Mr. Parker?
Yes, thank you all for coming this evening. I'm going to start with Mr. Berlow. Do you have two very simple questions? Do you have any stats on the potential increase in vaping usage here in DC, as well as is there any linkage or stats that you can provide from children or even adults going from vaping to, let's say, other tobacco products?
Yeah, for the district, we don't have great data. The most current data we have for e-cigarette use that I have that was provided to me by DC Health was from 2017. So recognizing how rapidly this epidemic is growing, and we know how quickly just over the last couple of years, we know that the 27 data is woefully out of date. So again, those numbers from 2017 were upwards of 30% of teens who had tried it, and 10% who are regular users. We know if we look at the national numbers currently, they are significantly higher than that. So I wouldn't want to speculate what the numbers are in the district, but looking at where the jump that we've seen from 2017 to 2019, we can expect the district to be similar to the rest of the country in a substantial jump. And again, nationally, we're seeing about over 25% of high school students are regular daily e-cigarette users.
Thanks. And then Senator Brown, it is great to see you. Thank you for coming to speak so passionately about not only social studies standards, but DC statehood. I'm going to throw out a question to you and Ms. Fuchs as well. If you could just speak to the opportunity to have student engagement in the DC statehood push and what that might mean as we are going to the drawing boards with our social studies standards. And then if I could just, because of time, and then Ms. Fuchs, as a high school teacher, if you could just briefly speak to what you're seeing in your classrooms regarding like gaps that students may have that you may attribute to the lack of social studies instruction in earlier grades.
Well,
and keep your comments to 20 seconds, then I'll
I would just say we've taken the standards that high school teachers are supposed to teach to in social studies, and we've connected in our website an example of DC statehood that teaches to every one of those standards. I mean, it's just amazing. I don't care if you're teaching about history or the civil rights movement or geography. That's the theme this year is geography. There's something in DC statehood for everyone.
What is that website?
I'm sorry?
What is the website?
Oh, it's called teachdemocracy.net.
Thanks.
And we do statehood. I mean, it is part of the DC history course. And I think DCPS's kind of website, like the official kind of stuff that you can use, does have, I mean, a big statehood unit. It is a big part of the course. They've helped narrow it down the past couple of years, so it may have been after your student graduated, and I don't know that all teachers, because we don't have to use it exactly as it's printed, but it is kind of it's one of the big 4 units in the DC history course now that's really dedicated to statehood. In terms of deficits, I mean, honestly, I don't see many. A lot of it's reading and writing, so it's more of a literacy thing, I think. Sometimes we get really complicated documents, and, you know, it's just kind of the accessibility of that. I don't know, I kind of view it as my job to just whatever they don't know, like that's what we're trying to figure out, and then we kind of move forward. And world history is, I don't know, you know, it's so big and broad, like there's so much you could know and be really good at, and I could still definitely, you know, help them find more they could learn, and then you could also be like, I've never heard of this, and it's like, well, great, now you will, and like, here we go from there. So I just find it can be so much to cover, it can be very overwhelming, and that's kind of the
Thank you for that. And I'm sure President Wattenberg will love to make the connection between reading deficits and social studies instruction.
Yes, I would. Thank you. Other comments, questions? Dr. Sutter?
Thank you all very much for your testimony. Mr. Berlow, I'll just say thank you, and I do hope that we can move forward this resolution and support it. I've lost multiple family members to complications of smoking-related illness, and that's deeply important to me. Senator Brown, thank you so much. I'm very excited to check out the website and learn about it, but I'm going to direct my questions to Ms. Fuchs. Ms. Fuchs and I disagree on many, many things, but we do not disagree on social studies, and so I'm very excited about her testimony tonight. So I wanted to ask you specifically around the piece about projects. I have had the joy of judging your students in the We the People project. I know your students do other projects. Talk to me about how you think we should include performance assessment as part of the way we think about the standards and revising the standards, to do so in a way that is beneficial and in line with good teaching practice as you see it, versus the drill and kill possibilities of doing something more standardized.
I mean, I do think like the C3 stuff is pretty decent. It seems like, you know, there's a lot there to work with, and kind of emphasizes those civic skills. Can also be very performative, and obviously a lot of it just comes out to implementation and how the district and all the charter LEAs do decide to implement whatever they're given. So I think it's mainly just going to come down to kind of the process of creating them and like working with the different LEAs, and probably especially with DCPS, to kind of figure out if they got this thing, what would that lead them to do? Because, and like obviously that can change, but you know, a lot of the concern just comes in with DCPS when they start feeling pressured to test or to like meet some metric, that everything suddenly becomes very forced and very, yeah, I mean, just performative. Like they have us write, you know, write a letter to the mayor about the Industrial Revolution. You're like, really? Like that's how we're gonna show our like commitment. And you know, like it's not that it's a bad letter. Like, it's a fine topic. It's just like, I'd rather the kids come up with something based on like the inequities that they find learning about industrialization, and they're like, whoa, and look at that. I see that right over here still. Like, you know, so I, you know, my kids write different letters, but like it's, so, you know, we're a work in progress though. So I think, and right now we still have a lot of flexibility. Every once in a while it gets tested, but I think teachers still have kind of room to work within what we've got, and if we keep that, I think it'll still be good.
Great. I also just want to share that Ms. Fuchs and I have had a couple of exchanges about how to continue involving teachers in the process, including surveys or roundtables, and so we'll continue to be in touch with teachers across the city, but also with the WTU to make sure that we're including teacher voice throughout the process. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Ms. Fuchs. Thank you very much for your testimony this evening. I'm sure we'll be in touch as we start to talk about the social studies standards. My questions, though, are going to be directed to Mr. Berlow this evening, and I'm going to have a little bit of a pushback for your questions, or for your testimony. In your testimony tonight, you talked about smoking and vaping being a teen epidemic. Are you aware that the CDC, when you said that, I think you said that, 27% of students are using vaping products and tobacco. Are you aware that of that, that's all teens that have ever used a tobacco product within 30 days. It's not 5.7% that are actually habitually using them.
Right, the numbers we are seeing right now are substantially greater than anything we have seen before. We had a historic low in smoking use, in tobacco use, and now we are seeing something that we've never seen before in this skyrocketing increase in tobacco use. And that is where our concern is. We've had decades of progress in reducing the addiction of nicotine and tobacco in our country. This new product is reversing public health benefits that took decades to achieve. So this is an epidemic that we feel is absolutely necessary to stop in its tracks before it gets even worse than it is.
Are you aware that vaping is 95% less harmful than smoking cigarettes?
That, first of all, that's a number that we know gets bandied about.
It's a number that the Public Health England, Royal College of Physicians, multiple other organizations have used.
Right, and that's data that's been used by the vaping industry for years and years. That seems to be the only evidence they've been able to provide from England, this survey from years ago. Okay. Again, and when you say it's 95%, which for less harmful, which I'm not going to acknowledge that stat, that's not to say it's not harmful. E-cigarettes contain nicotine. Nicotine is highly addictive. I think, as most of you know, nicotine has significant impacts on adolescent brain development. That's another significant issue that is going to have problems down the road. So this is not a safe product. It is not a harmless product. It is highly addictive. It's a tobacco product. The district considers these and defines them as a tobacco product. We've taken great steps.
I have another question.
So again, it's not a safe product to use.
Right. We all agree that, and I think all of us on this board agree that smoking is bad and it should be out of the hands of anyone under the age of 18. However, I do worry that a ban would force a dangerous black market, as we've seen in some of the marijuana and THC products. I also have a problem that studies clearly show that vaping is a much more successful smoking cessation tool than patches and gum, and that adult former smokers are the ones who prefer these flavored products just as much as kids, studies have shown, and that particularly for women, they neurobiologically do not respond as well to nicotine replacement products as men. So when we talk about a full-out ban, we could be potentially harming and hurting the parents of students that we're trying to help, who might want to go back to cigarettes instead of using the vape products that they're currently using now.
Yeah, and we're certainly happy to provide you and the rest of the board with any data that you would like to correct the record, certainly. Some of these questions about black market those are arguments that industry has made here in the district previously. As I mentioned in my testimony, and as you all know, the district has some of the absolute strongest tobacco control policies in the country. Just last year, the district raised its tax to the highest tax level in the country, which we know is the single best strategy to prevent youth or anyone from using tobacco products. The tobacco age has been increased to 21. And in both cases, industry made those black market claims. There is not evidence to support that. Again, we're happy to provide you with any evidence to the contrary. But again, we know that these are harmful products. Kids, as I said, are using e-cigarettes and then transitioning on to cigarettes. Kids who otherwise would have never used a tobacco product now are being enticed by those flavors. And that's where the evidence is clear, is that it's the cotton candy, the mango, gummy bears, you name it, that is encouraging and enticing kids to start. And when they start, they're becoming addicted.
Instead of banning, have you thought about more and harsher enforcement of these laws? They're already prohibited, so banning doesn't seem to do much, especially when we have Maryland and Virginia, who many of these students live back and forth with their parents. They're often in all of these different states.
Well, I would agree with you that we need strong enforcement.
Wait, can I just say one thing? I allowed everybody to go on too long, so I'm actually donating my comment time, and so you can take 40 more seconds to finish your response.
Sure. Well, I would agree with you that we need strong tobacco control enforcement, and I think the district does do that well. We can't control what Maryland and Virginia do. I certainly would encourage both of those jurisdictions to pass similar legislation, which I know both are considering when they go into session next year. Again, this is something that everyone around the country is looking to address. It's not something unique to the district. This is a national crisis that every city, county, and state around the country is looking to address. So enforcement is a critically important piece of it. Raising the age to 21 here in the district was an important piece of keeping all tobacco products away from children. But again, this is something new. This is an emerging product that all of a sudden, because of the marketing practices that Juul used to entice kids, we have seen this skyrocketing use that we hadn't anticipated. And as a result, we need to do something very quickly to stop that in its tracks, and that's what these types of policies will do.
Thank you. Who do I have next? Mr. O'Leary, Dr. O'Leary?
Thank you.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Berlow, because we all know that this epidemic, as you described it, is affecting our youth in ways we've never seen before, and it's a shame that the progress we've made the past decades are sort of being overturned now because of the efforts of big tobacco. And I wanted to direct my question towards Ms. Fuchs. You talked about, you described it, allowing teachers to specialize. And I just wanted to know, would you say this type of teaching is more effective than teaching to the test, and just sort of expound upon allowing teachers to specialize?
Sure. So I'll just use my department as an example. So at HD Woodson, I'm probably the world history person. I don't know as much about U.S. history as I arguably should. I went to an international baccalaureate school for high school. When I went to college, they really kind of let me go ahead and continue specializing in studying the world, unless the U.S. So I have taught U.S. history for several years. It's not that I can't do it, but it's not maybe where my heart lies compared to a lot of my colleagues. And so getting to have me in World II, where I can pull Truth Commission reports and all this other information that I studied in college, kind of allows me to really give students a different perspective than is offered maybe in the standard DCPS curriculum. I don't use the textbook at all unless we read a section and then point out everything that's wrong with it. It gives my students a chance to really dive deep because I'm passionate about it, and it helps usually translate that passion, at least to some of them, or they kind of at least acknowledge that maybe it's not so bad. And, kind of teaching to a test, I would not be able to go off on some quote-unquote tangent about Guatemala for 4 days, which is in the standards, but probably if there was a test would be one very limited question, and I'd need to move on to do far more coverage in an attempt to make sure my students could do it. And then I do find I love my students. They're very bright. They love engaging with content, but they do struggle with some of the basic test-taking skills that often wind up in a social studies type standard exam, which could then make them not display their knowledge the way that I know they have it. And so it then would make me have to spend quite a bit more time on things like vocabulary instruction and memorization, which not that it doesn't have value, it does. And they should learn, the tier 3 vocabulary words and tier 2 vocabulary words, but it becomes so much more of a focus, and in a limited time, and especially a content like World History 2, which is just a ton of stuff, I'd just rather not. I think they get that instruction elsewhere, and there's kind of more opportunities to really play with the material and get to have fun with it. So that's kind of my take on that.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. Did you want to get Dr. O'Leary?
I'd like to ask about how do the kids get the vaping products?
Well, any number of ways. Unfortunately, the industry makes it very easy for kids to buy them online, so that is a challenge. We know that as enforcement is an important part of this, so we need to make sure that if kids are going to a corner store, to a 7-Eleven, to anywhere that sells tobacco products, that the IDs are being checked. In the district, you have to be 21 to purchase a tobacco product that includes e-cigarettes. So I agree with you that enforcement is an important piece of it. And kids can get these just like kids have got tobacco products forever through older friends or family, someone asking someone outside in the store. So again, ensuring that we have really strong education and enforcement of the retail environment is a critical piece of it. But again, also it's making sure that we are preventing the desire for these products and really focusing on prevention, both in schools and in our communities, and making sure that these are products that kids don't want. And again, industry selling and marketing these fruit flavor and candy flavored products make kids want them.
And the desire for it is because it's so attractive. It's not a cigarette that, you know, looks sort of ugly-ish, and it tastes good, and it doesn't have a lot of negative connotations, although the nicotine in the vaping products is much stronger than it is in cigarettes.
Yeah, and and you all probably know better than I, but we hear all the time that kids are saying, you know, cigarettes are disgusting. I would never smoke a cigarette. And again, that's because of decades of progress in changing social norms and education and policy. Cigarettes are not cool for kids, but because of the marketing that Juul has done, they've made these a cool product. As you said, these products look like a USB drive, or it looks like an Apple Watch, or other things. They're made to deceive teachers and parents and anyone else who might not know what they are. And again, yes, it is the flavors. The evidence is clear that it is those, the kids are saying, if it weren't for those flavors and it tasted like a cigarette, I wouldn't want that. But because it tastes like flavors that they like, I was at a conference yesterday and a teen was talking about, it was Captain Crunch flavor, and she said, that was my favorite cereal as a kid. Now I have this Captain Crunch vape that I can smoke. So
And
yes,
we only have a couple of seconds in the, I know there's a huge viewing public, but the parents need to know how deadly these products are. Not just casually deadly, but deadly.
As you said, one Juul pod has the amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, as 20 cigarettes. So again, a student can be puffing away in the back of class all day long on a Juul pod. The teacher might not know, because it looks like they're just chewing on a USB drive, and that could be the equivalent of 20 cigarettes. It's equivalent nicotine.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Gasoi?
Hi, thank you very much, all of you, for your testimony. I wanted to, I have questions for Laura Fuchs first, and then if we have time for you. So, Ms. Fuchs, you mentioned that there are many things that should be updated, and you mentioned Latin America as one specific area. I'm wondering if there are other specific content areas, but also if there's anything about the organization of the standards that would be helpful, you know, to overhaul or change, or
So World 2 is kind of, I mean, it's my baby. I have taught all the core content areas over my 13 years, but World 2 is the one that kind of holds my heart. And World 2 is problematic, in my opinion. I don't think it has to be, because within the standards that I already have, I've tried to organize them to make them less problematic, and believe that I have, in terms of just how much it is Europe-centered. Now, I get that modern world history, there is kind of this bias towards really focusing on Europe and its drive of imperialism, and then how that kind of then affects everyone else. And that is valuable to learn, and sometimes I feel like I'm too focused on it, even with the changes that I've made. But it is a world history course, and I've noticed in U.S. history, the content standards are arguably very similar when it comes to kind of the world perspective that comes into the U.S. history course. It is, you know, it turns into like a Western Civ. And so a lot of things are very repetitious, the way DCPS is doing it anyways. I don't think they have to within the standards we have, because you can prioritize standards and you can find, like, you know, and I think that can be a very individual thing for a teacher. So I don't know that like it has to be, but the volume of ones that are just kind of straight Europe and arguably kind of white focused far outnumber the rest in a world history course, and to me that is problematic. We should just call it Western Civ if that's really what they're going for. Since I hope that is not what they're going for, then that could maybe be a specific thing to kind of look into. But there is like a lot of really interesting stuff. So I mean, like, I think it's just about how you prioritize. And so I do worry sometimes that paring things down too much and making things too broad suddenly could also open the door to the opposite problem where it's like, well, you could just hang out over here all the time and then never have to go elsewhere. And so, I don't know. So I struggle with that. Depth and breadth, it's the eternal battle in social studies, and it's a fun one in its own way, but it's tough. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't have more time, but later.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Brown and Ms. Fuchs, thank you for coming, I think, to kick this discussion off. I think it's a long-anticipated discussion that this board has been working towards beginning for quite a while, and I think we're all excited about really beginning this work in earnest. I think you both spoke to the fact that our students, in conversations with them in many forms, want to find themselves more in our social studies curriculum, either the history that's more rich about where they and their ancestors came from, or about the city that they live in, about the one that was, the one we currently have, and I think that'll inform them in so many tremendous ways about the city that they can shape in their futures. And so absolutely we are looking towards including your voices and so many others focused on making sure that our young people not just walk away with a education that teaches them about the world around them, but also about the pockets of the world that they live in and experience every day. Mr. Berlow, I want to thank you for coming, but also want to thank all of the young people and their allies who joined us in the room today as well. I think the presence of our young people speaks to the indisputable fact that this crisis is impacting the young people in our community, and that it's imperative on our leaders to do it. It's a real, clear, and present threat to the health and safety of our students and our young people, just like on all the other issues that disproportionately impact them, are always first in line. And I think it's the obligation of leaders in this city to follow their lead. And so I look forward to working with my colleagues to passing a resolution next month to that effect, to ensure that we are on record in standing with our young people to I think beat back this epidemic and make sure that the progress we made isn't rolled back. And we also know, I think, the dire consequences when leaders in our city don't take urgent action on clear and present dangers to the health and safety of our young people. We've already had a fatality in our city of a young person, and if we want to prevent more young people from dying at the hands of products that seem harmless but are tremendously harmful, then it's an imperative that we do that. And also given that our president has reneged on a commitment to take federal action to ban these products, it's imperative now that localities work as quickly as possible to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that these products get out of the hands of our young people. So I look forward again to working with the young leaders in this room who have brought this issue to the table to make sure that their voices are heard and that our leaders do everything that they can to protect them, because it is on us, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that they're backed up and that their health and safety is protected. So thank you so much.
Okay, anybody else? All right. Thank you all very much. I've yielded my time, so I don't get to interrogate you tonight, but I'm very supportive of all of your causes, and thank you very, very much for coming to join us.
Thank you.
So we're now going to turn to social studies. Social studies is where students learn about civics, geography, economics, and history. It's where students learn about things like checks and balances, American and world history, and how and why Americans get involved in civic and political action. As the nation's capital, as many people have noted, we have a special obligation to ensure that our social studies standards are up to date and utilize the resources available in this historic, great city without representation that we live in. And with that, I want to turn it over to our Ward 6 colleague and chair of the Social Studies Standards Committee, Dr. Jessica Sutter, for any remarks she has prior to the first panel.
Thank you, President Wattenberg. Thank you all for coming out tonight to help us kick off our review and process of revision of the DC Social Studies Standards. I really appreciate President Wattenberg's earlier statements and stats on why it's so important that the board is taking this work up now. The DC Social Studies Standards were written in 2006. They were adopted in 2007, but they were written in 2006. I am nervous to ask my student board colleagues how old they were in 2006. I taught social studies in DC in 2006, but these standards, just for some comparison, predate the existence of the State Board of Education. They predate the existence of the current Office of the State Superintendent of Education. They were written for and by the District of Columbia Public Schools. Charter LEAs had not been involved in the writing of these standards at the time they were generated. There is no mention of President Barack Obama in our standards. So perhaps it's long past time to revise the standards. Another fun fact, at least 15 states in the nation have updated their standards twice since our standards were first written. So it is my hope that as we undertake this process, that in addition to working on improvements in our standards, we also set forth a process that can be a model for revision of other academic standards within the District of Columbia. The old standards do have strengths. They were written by teachers and educators, and I hope that we can maintain that as part of our process. They have good coverage of lots of parts of history, not just of the United States, but of other countries. We talk about geography, we do cover civics. We may have too much in our standards, and I think the depth versus breadth tension that Ms. Fuchs raised in public comment is one I hope we also contend with in this. There are a few things we said we really care about as a board as we review the current standards and contemplate how to revise them. Specifically, we're interested in looking at early elementary content and how much content we think our young students can actually handle. We are concerned about civic education, making sure that we think not just about content knowledge about our government processes, but also about actions, skills, and dispositions in civic education. We're interested in making sure our standards are culturally relevant and responsive to the students of the District of Columbia, and that we think about pedagogical approaches that can be incorporated in standards and their guideline documents. We're concerned about knowledge building over time and making sure that our standards build knowledge in a progression that makes sense for our students. And we are, as I mentioned already, concerned about this tension of depth versus breadth and making sure that we write standards that can be taught by all of our LEAs in the way that they are written and designed. So we're very excited to kick this off. I want to emphasize one thing before we hear from our panelists, and that is that this is a process. Tonight we are hearing from educators in the city to talk to us about their experience with teaching social studies, working with our social studies standards here in DC. We expect to have further opportunities for public engagement, both from students, from other interested parties within the city, organizations that work with social studies content, citizens that have thoughts and comments on our standards. We also expect to be working hand in hand with the Office of the State Superintendent to create a process for the creation of new standards as well as for continuous public comment on the process. So we thank you all for helping us kick this off. This is the beginning of an ongoing process, and we're excited to hear from educators tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, I'm going to call up people for the panel. As I call your name, please come to the table. Ayman Mohammed from DCPS. Kelly Akan from Mundo Verde. Oh, she may be checking out slides. Jerome Clemons, Center City. Michelle Bollinger, Wilson High School, DCPS. Michael Stevens, Friendship. Lindsay McCrea, DCPS. Okay, thank you very much. So you each have 3 minutes, and I have directions here. But anyway, after 2.5 minutes, the light will turn yellow, and then at 3 minutes it will turn red. And following that, we'll have a round of questions, and each member will have 3 minutes, which includes both their questions and your answers. So they are encouraged to be brief, and you are encouraged to be concise. Where should we start? Wait, you were first. You were.
All right. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jerome Clemons, Jr. I'm currently a 7th and 8th grade humanities teacher at Center City Public Charter School, Shaw Campus. As a teacher in Washington, D.C. for over 10 years, I would first like to thank you for this opportunity. I first would like to begin my testimony with a Latin proverb, docendo discimus, which means, by teaching, we learn. This quote has been my teaching mantra and classroom motto for years. I always hope that while I teach, I'm also learning about my students, the classroom, and school community in the ever-changing world. The DC Social Studies standards have been helpful in guiding and creating a foundation of learning in my humanities classroom. I've always viewed social studies as an all-you-can-eat buffet-style subject. With the help of the DC Social Studies standards, I'm able to serve my students a full plate of different servings of history, geography, economics, culture, and political science. The DC standards help me to understand and know what should be essential and daily on the students' learning plates. But it is time to update the menu at the buffet. I like that the standards are detailed in scope. I have found that my current students, though, love technology, project-based learning, and expressing their individual voice through creative writing. Washington, D.C. has an unlimited amount of locations to explore and experts to utilize. We should do more of this within the standards and see that in the standards, but also for the teachers. In my best practices, I have found that allowing student voice to be expressed through creativity is critical to knowledge building. We must continue to prepare the future students through constantly critically thinking of how we can best utilize technology. My recommendations would include more student voice and choice through project-based learning. I challenge the board to think about how to incorporate more inclusive and diverse learning goals and standards for different styles of learning, visual, musical, verbal, kinesthetic, and even mathematical. I would broaden the scope to focus on geographical regions, and I would begin to move the themes to more contemporary topics like identity, representation, and immigration. I would make sure that the standards are inclusive for all students and their different styles of learning. Are the lessons and the standards we are teaching students designed to prepare them for students, or designed to prepare the students for life outside the classroom? That should be our goal. I would advise Ozzy and the board to engage both veteran and new teachers on their input in the glows and grows of the current standards. I would focus my attention on making sure that the standards are prepared to meet the students of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You were called next, right?
I think he was actually, but it doesn't matter.
Good evening. My name is Michael Stevens, and I'm the Director of Social Studies for Friendship Public Charter School. Friendship is the third largest LEA in DC, serving over 4,000 students in grades PK through 12. Earlier this year, I, along with other social studies directors and teacher leaders from DCPS and other charter networks, formed a task force with the objective of assessing the status of social studies instruction in Washington, D.C. To do this, we designed a survey, shared it with social studies teachers and leaders in both DCPS and charter, and anonymously collected results. The survey was organized around 6 categories, one of them being standards. I would like to share with you key findings in that area. To the question of how satisfied are you with the current District of Columbia social studies standards for the courses offered at your school, only 12% of respondents indicated that they were very satisfied, and nearly 40% of all respondents indicated that they were unsatisfied or not sure. These data points are troubling and clearly speak to teacher and leader dissatisfaction with the current DCSS. Through their commentary, respondents allowed us to identify and organize 3 broad categories of dissatisfaction. 1, organization and sequence. 2, a focus of breadth over depth of knowledge. And 3, cultural relevance and lack of perspective. 1, organization and sequence. Social studies teachers and leaders indicated that they want students to progress from one grade to the next by studying history chronologically or examining related concepts and content. However, multiple respondents indicated that they do not understand or do not see a clear pattern and rationale for the progression of standards and content from one grade to the next. I provided examples in my written testimony and can share them during Q&A. Relatedly, other respondents indicated that while they and their students may enjoy specific content or topics that the standards address in their course, they do not understand how their inclusion fits into a larger pattern or narrative. Again, examples are included in my written testimony. 2, a focus on breadth over depth of knowledge. Several respondents indicated that because DCSS includes so many standards for each grade level, particularly for the middle and high school level, the result is that teachers cover many topics at a surface level rather than probing deeper into more targeted content and concepts. Respondents also felt that by attempting to address all the content-specific standards in a course, they were unable to incorporate more cognitively demanding practices and habits of mind into their daily instruction. Excerpts of teacher commentary are included in written testimony and can be shared during Q&A. Third, cultural relevance and lack of perspective. The most frequent concern raised over DCSS centers around the belief that it does not offer a variety of perspectives or viewpoints. Multiple respondents used words or phrases like Eurocentric, European, or white-centered, or whitewashed to describe DCSS. Additionally, other respondents indicated that DCSS needs to be more culturally relevant and integrate a greater variety of perspectives and viewpoints. Unfortunately, most respondents who raised these concerns did not provide examples. However, given the volatility and importance of the issue, as well as the frequency with which it was raised, it is not something that should be overlooked. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Lindsay McCrea, and I'm the manager for Social Studies Content and Curriculum with DC Public Schools. I'm also a former social studies teacher in DCPS. In DCPS, we strive to empower students to become inquisitive, informed, and engaged members of society who use critical thinking, inquiry, and literacy to prepare for college careers and civic life. In 2013, the National Council of the Social Studies published the College Career and Civic Life, or C3 framework, which DCPS adopted to support the purposeful integration of content with social studies skills through inquiry-based instruction. DCPS has grown to promote such inquiry-based and student-centered practices. Nationally, most other states have updated their state standards to support inquiry and align to the C3 framework. Locally, DC standards need review and revision. We believe that the existing standards lack some of the important practices that are most impactful on student outcomes in literacy, civic engagement, and social emotional dispositions. I want to take this opportunity to share specific items that DCPS would like to see in updated social studies standards. First, we frequently hear from teachers and students that our standards are not culturally relevant, sustaining, or affirming. The dominant narrative of Western European powers and the decisions of white Americans are the primary focus of the standards from kindergarten through 12th grade, while the experiences of marginalized peoples continues to be marginalized in DC state standards. All of our students deserve to see their own cultural, racial, and social backgrounds reflected in the curriculum. Additionally, the granularity of the standards means that some topics that are less culturally relevant or historically significant are prioritized over other relevant topics in the name of covering content. While it is important to maintain clarity in the standards must also be flexible enough to allow for in-depth inquiry and cultural relevance to maximize student engagement and thus learning. As another consideration, I want to highlight that the standards serve as the basis of curriculum, instruction, and assessments. Because of these connections, our standards must be historically accurate and significant, reflective of the best thinking in the field, and culturally relevant to our students. We must also be mindful of the time necessary for appropriate curricular adjustments, professional learning, and assessment development in order to implement new standards with fidelity and success. The DCPS Social Studies team has collaborated with other states to revise their social studies standards. The most successful revision processes engaged a wide variety of stakeholders and educators from diverse backgrounds and expertise, while partnering with standards writing experts. Sufficient time for review and feedback from those stakeholders is essential to a thorough and robust development process of high-quality standards. In closing, I thank you for the opportunity to share DCPS's perspective on this very important topic, and we appreciate your continued partnership in support of our students. Thank you.
Since calling this panel, have any other people who were on the panels come in? I saw some people come in. Ayman Mohammed, Kelly Akan, Michelle Bollinger. Okay, all right. With that, we are ready to go to questions. So would you like to be always our starter, or?
I'm happy to. I'm honored to. Thank you. So first I want to thank you for coming, and I want to just say to the viewing audience, I want to thank all of the other teachers who provided written testimony. We realize that November, which and 2 days away from the start of the National Council for the Social Studies Conference. Perhaps not the best time to hold such an educator panel, hindsight being 2020. But we know a lot of teachers who had other events to do tonight did submit written testimony, and we're just incredibly thankful to get the perspectives from both the classroom perspective as well as from the district perspective. So first question I have, I'm glad that so many of you mentioned the same thing around this need to increase the cultural relevance of our standards to students. I also really appreciated the metaphor you provided on the changing the menu at the buffet. And I like this perspective of keeping a buffet. Given our desire to be mindful of the tension of depth and breadth, but also recognizing the need to increase cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness, how do you think we could begin to approach that need for change, the need for new items on the menu, when I imagine we'll see some pushback about whichever items we choose to take off?
Sure.
Easy question, I get it.
So I had this in my testimony as well, but that tension is very much present, and cultural relevance depends on the specific culture and group of students that you are in front of. So really to codify cultural relevance is impossible for a district to do. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to standards. But I think it's important to recognize that standards can be phrased in such a way to allow for greater cultural relevance to be taken by the teachers in the classroom and those instructional decisions to be made, as well as to what Ms. Fuchs spoke of earlier, there just are too many standards about people and places that are not culturally relevant to any of our students. So really making sure that if the topic is relevant to a large group of our students, that topic is given priority and prominence over others.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of different ways to address this. At one level, at a very precise place, people have talked already about the granularity of the DC standards and the significant amount of them. So at any point when you have so many standards written to such a level of precision, it is impossible to bring any new perspective to the table. So I think the first solution to that would be broadening the standards and the coverage so it is more of a key idea, enduring understanding concept. I think that's probably one way to go about doing that. And then the second is, I think, just being very cognitive about taking a step back and looking at a whole course approach, a whole content approach of courses and what is being covered. To give you one example, if I were to go into DCSS right now, the electronic version, and hit Control F and search Africa in the 9th and 10th grade world history courses, I would stop reading about it, 1200, Mansa Musa, Silk Road. Then all of a sudden, I would jump to imperialism for victimhood, slavery in between, and then that's about it. So I think you'd be very hard-pressed to have a conversation with anyone and walk away that that's acceptable.
Thank you.
One recommendation for me I've seen and that I use in the classroom is just making it geographically based. So almost starting to broaden the theme based upon the regions in the regional areas and focus the topics on the region. And then additionally, just doing daily activities. I find that the more that we really try to incorporate daily do-nows that are somewhat repetition, but also really focused in on making sure that we're getting the foundations of social studies in our daily activities.
Thank you.
Mr. Parker. No questions? Great. Ms. Williams.
About it being culturally relevant, but how do so many different backgrounds, ethnicities, etc. How do you do that successfully? Do you do it by the students' ethnicity in the school, or do you have cross sectors? How do you even begin to formulate that type of in-depth?
So I think that's a really good question, because it's impossible to say that this set of standards is culturally relevant to every single student in the District of Columbia. I I think it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that the curriculum and instruction and the standards and everything else that touch our students is as culturally relevant as possible. So including those broad concepts is one way to do that. Another way is to include more skills, thinking that allow for that flexibility within the classroom. So thinking critically about different groups that were in power at that time versus groups that were oppressed by others in a different historical period or that same historical period, and how different groups were treated, and just allowing, just bringing greater variety to the standards other than the white or European experience that is currently in the standards.
I think the only thing I would add to that is I don't think that anyone would want to suggest a tokenism approach of like incorporating 40 different voices on a particular topic, right? I think it's more the idea of ensuring, are we only providing the dominant narrative history in our standards and content?
And then finally, just having a storehouse of information. I think as a teacher, we're always looking for updated and new information, so it's always relevant if it would already be somewhat collected and available for teachers to already know where we could find that information.
Dr. O'Leary?
Yes, Mr. Stevens, you were talking about a survey. How many people responded to that survey?
I don't have the numbers off my head, but I think it was around 80.
Okay. You mentioned that almost half of the respondents were either unsatisfied or not sure whether they were, I don't know if that means they were not sure about being satisfied or being unsatisfied, but it's a big number of teachers who weren't satisfied with the standards. The standards are way too broad, right? Is narrowing down the concept of what is being taught, is that one of the things that a solution to making the standards work?
No, I think that it would be more the idea of going 6 feet wide and not 6 feet, going 6 feet deep and not 6 feet
So
wide.
that it would, okay.
So often as the current standards are. That I think Ms. Fuchs spoke to this earlier, to Ms. McCrea, that it leads to much more of a coverage approach of history, which is bad for a couple of reasons. First off, that just doesn't allow students to get a lot of knowledge, but also it doesn't allow the teacher to design an inquiry-based approach to learning or promote a lot of higher-level Bloom's type thinking that we all, of course, want kids exposed to.
Great. The question about technology that you were talking about, one of the problems that we had when the PARCC test started, for example, was that the school didn't have enough computers to be able to take the test. And when you're talking about, you've got different schools have different levels of technology in the charters and especially in the public schools. Is that a drawback as far as, I mean, do you need the technology in order for kids to learn social studies?
I would definitely say it definitely helps in the classroom. It's one of the tools, you know, I jokingly say I carry around like a toolbox, and I'm always looking to add more and new and improved tools in my toolbox.
Right.
And the computer, like we've known, has been a great tool. It's also how you use it. So if you don't know how to properly use the tool properly, it's not a benefit to you. So it's also teaching proper technology usage in the classroom. So even typing skills, some of the, you know, old-fashioned things that, you know, some of us might have learned, and, you know, oh, okay, how do we, you know, probably place our hands on the keyboard?
Right.
Going back to that to actually then prepare them for the full usage. Now, yes, it is a challenge if, you know, there aren't enough computers in the classroom, but I also feel that, like, if we make it a priority,
right.
I think that that's the goal. I feel like.
And that is theoretically the goal of DCPS. I've got one more question for Ms. McCrea about how are new teachers prepared to meet the standards in DCPS?
Sure. So we do a new teacher orientation every year. That's across content areas. That's organized by the district. The social studies team this year has continued to have a new teacher cohort at our district professional development days. There's also support that teachers get from their in-school content lead or instructional coach. that they get ongoing support that way. So there's just a few of the ways that we're supporting new teachers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Mr. Burton, Ms. Burton, jeez, sorry.
My question was already asked about like how can you diversify and make education more culturally relevant without the backlash, because I mean everybody's real sensitive nowadays, so you can't really go deep into things without people saying things. So I'm all for the cultural relevancy. I took U.S. history last year and we barely had enough time to cover everything, and the entire AP exam was about everything that we didn't cover. So that was fun, but I'm for the initiative, and I'm glad teachers and people have students' backs.
Thank you. Ms. McCrea.
Thank you for being here this evening. I know several of my colleagues have already pointed out the question I'm going to kind of ask. It does have to deal with cultural relevance. When you are teaching, and you guys have all talked about the importance of teaching to cultural relevance, what about events, though, that might be critically important but not necessarily culturally relevant to your classroom? For instance, a couple months back, we had public comment about an individual who wanted more teaching with our standards to the Armenian genocide. That is a critically important event, okay? However, Armenian culture is not a large, population in your classroom. Could you describe how you in your classroom, and Ms. Fuchs during that meeting talked about how she incorporates that into her lessons. Could you talk about how you would incorporate that instance or another example into your lessons?
So I was actually just at the Holocaust Museum this morning with our chancellor, and we have a Holocaust cornerstone where students are able to visit the museum. So I think that's a very similar example of something that is extremely significant in dealing with history, but not necessarily reflective of most of our students' cultures. And I think the way to do that is by presenting it as a topic and an issue, or a concept, an issue within social justice. So students can see the patterns throughout history. They can also see that some of the things that they're experiencing in their own community or their own world mirror that same experience of that group of people. Also, through an inquiry approach, students can take the direction in a project that most speaks to them or most resonates with them, whether that they want that to be culturally relevant or not, so they can kind of take the content in a direction that is most appropriate for their own experiences.
The only thing I would share from an example is at Friendship, we've recently turned to the New York framework as a guide. They have standards explicitly around human rights violation, social justice, so that allowed us to design a unit for the 10th grade course, which is very much aligned with what Ms. McCrea was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
And then just personally, as a middle school teacher, I'm in a co-teaching classroom where I have a co-teacher, and we do close reading. So taking, for example, so it might be a news article specifically on that topic, and then spending the entire week in going in depth on that subject and really getting the students to really buy in, knowing that that's going to be the focus for that entire week.
Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Thank you. Dr. Gasoi.
Hi, thank you so much. I don't know where to begin, but I will just begin. So I guess, we are really trying to conceptualize what this will look like, the organization of it. And, everything that you say, it's like a little light bulb, like, but what will it look like? So I guess my question is, one way that I'm picturing this is we keep the focus on content, maybe update some things, but then there are like overlays in terms of, this is how you might address this if you want to do a hands-on project, related to the Armenian genocide. Or, this is how these are the places that you would go. And, sort of like my colleague Jessica said, like a guide that goes along with it. So that would be one way to do it. Or I'm also thinking about, like, should we focus more on concepts instead of content, and then have it switch, sort of like, for instance, concepts like family formation, forms of government, and then here are suggestions for content that might plug into that at different levels of sophistication by grade, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there so I don't use all my time. Does that make sense? Like how you envision this being most helpful?
I mean, I think that you certainly raise a number of good points. I think that in terms of what's most helpful, it's critically important to remember that standards are not curriculum. Standards are designed to assist schools, LEAs, in designing their curriculum. So I do caution against being overly prescriptive of project approaches. Like, I mean, Ms. Fuchs gave the comical example earlier, right, of like writing the letter to the mayor, because that's something, I think we can all agree that's something we want to avoid doing.
Right.
But to your point, I do believe that the standards need a healthy blend and marriage of content and skills-based, and skills that schools should then design projects to accomplish and reach towards.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, just providing exemplars. So, being able for the teacher and even the schools to know ideally what you're looking for. So I think the standards help us to know what we should teach, but to also see what an ideal or what a great project or what, the final result would look for would be beneficial.
I'm going to yield the rest of my time. I think they said what I would say too.
Great. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Mr. Clemons. You talked about project-based learning, and on the student advisory committee, something we're looking at is productivity within the classroom, and specifically towards social studies, where there seems to be a disconnect between students and like the social studies that they're learning through our education system. So I just wanted you to touch on like some of that project-based learning, because I know in my school, something that's always worked with one of my favorite history teachers are like sequence chains, things that can show causation and correlation between events. So yeah.
I think project-based learning is just beneficial because it both allows for individual work, but also teamwork. So it gives the classroom an environment where it's not quiet. So I think sometimes, as teachers, we always want the classroom to be, all right, everybody's quietly doing their work and we're all doing this. For project-based learning, you will come into the classroom and there's noise and there's people moving and there's stuff being moved around. And you see what I find is the socialization of the classroom. So you see students who typically might not work together having to socialize and interact with each other. So it might reduce confrontations because now, somebody who you wouldn't ideally talk to, I might force you because of the number I counted off is now somehow magically the person you didn't want to talk to, and now you're working together. So it really incorporates the opportunity for students to work together, but I also feel it gives the opportunity for students to really find their own passion. So if you are able to choose the country you would like to research, instead of me assigning you, hey, this is the European country you're doing, let me give you the student choice. So giving students the choice and the opportunity to make the decision in helping to learn what they would like to learn. And then presenting, okay, here are the requirements though. This is what you have to do in order to complete the project.
Yeah, and my other questions was for you, Mr. Stevens. I was reminded in your testimony where you talked about organization and sequence and how sometimes things don't necessarily follow a chronological order. And I was reminded by how, especially I feel that when we learn about some of these non-European and non-white groups, we tend to only learn about them when they're interacting with Europeans. And I just wanted to sort of see what you had to say about how in our social studies standards, that's something that can be revised so that we're not just learning about Africans when they're being colonized, or we're not talking about Indians just when the British are colonizing them through trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said that perfectly, and that is that comes back to, again, the goal of ensuring that we are not just teaching the dominant narrative version of history, or, as you said, how indigenous or other cultures merely interacted with Europeans, and that's why they now matter in history, right? I think that is a critical lens to look at. To briefly speak to the sequence, because you mentioned that, like 2 examples that jump to mind that teachers shared in their commentary is they were very confused, if you follow the 8th grade U.S. history progression, why the 8th grade course ends with the Industrial Revolution or industrialism, and then magically in 11th grade they picked up again. That just seems very odd for a student's mind to operate that way in following. In 1st grade, teachers talked about how, like, oh yeah, my kids love when we study the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca. That's great. I don't see at all how it fits into this course, though. It just seems like this bizarre one-off. That's a great unit, but what does it have to do with the rest of this course and why kids are taking it?
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson, thank you. Dr. Sutter is Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. We know you have other things you could be doing at their time, and we really appreciate your insight here as we begin this process. So just from the history side alone, we're talking about the entire recorded history of the human race, right? That's really hard to jam into 4 years of standards, much less the other pieces that are actually social studies and government. So I wonder if you could take a minute and each of you give us sort of either a theory of action or what you call a mission statement for our social studies standards, or sort of that 30,000-foot view of this is what we need to do, and then we're going to work the next several months or perhaps even a year on filtering down and making sure that the standards are correct. And we'll start on my left, your right.
I wish I'd brought our social studies department mission statement, because I would have cheated and just read directly off of that. No, I mean, I think that you raise a good point, right? Like, how can we make a goal around teaching all of human history? So I think it's more the idea of using social studies as a vehicle to teach students to be civically engaged, to make them aware and have an appreciation for history and geography and interaction and relationships of other cultures. I talk to teachers about this a lot, but I always question how badly we have failed when social studies is the boring subject. Right?
Agreed.
I mean, social studies is awesome. It's why do people do what they do? And if we can organize content in a way that allows kids to question those things as critical thinking people, then I think we can all say we've done a job well done.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yep. I'll just restate, the Latin quote that I began with, docendo discimus, meaning by teaching we learn. Hopefully by what we're teaching them, we're also learning about them, but we're also inspiring the next generation of teachers. I'm someone who grew up, born in Washington, D.C., but grew up in South Carolina, but I knew as a middle school child myself that I wanted to teach in Washington, D.C., in South Carolina, where I wrote a middle school essay about that, and I really look to try to inspire the next generation of teachers in the classroom for that same kind of inspiration, knowing that, hey, if you set a goal as a child, you never know, where it can send you, but knowing that hopefully the goals and the standards that we are teaching them is helping to inspire those goals. So if you don't know about the world, you can inspire to try to go travel the world.
Thank you.
I think along similar lines as my colleagues here, I actually did work in my mission statement to my testimony. So,
that wasn't one of the questions.
I think out of social studies state standards, however, we are looking to equip students with the content knowledge that they need and the skills that they need in order to question their society, to absorb what's going on around them, and to participate actively as an engaged citizen in order to make change if they see change as necessary.
Thank you, and I've gone over, but thank you all. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here this evening, and I think you set me up really good for my one question that I have for the panel. We've heard a lot of discussion about how social studies, especially in today's day and age, could be such an important vehicle for, I think, values-based or thematic instruction. I think around the themes of democracy and equality, civic participation and advocacy, diversity. I guess generally, how do you see that, or how important do you think weaving that values-based instruction is into our social studies curriculum, especially at such a critical time in our history? And also, how important do you think that instruction is in helping students identify threats to a free society in our present day?
Well, I think it's the responsibility of social studies educators to identify places in history where those rights have been violated in the past and the different actions that people have taken in the face of those violations and injustices. I also think that, you know, it's the responsibility of educators within a framework of inquiry, like the skills set out by the C3 framework, to be able to tailor their classroom experiences to that of their students, to emphasize the values that they wish to in their classroom.
Yeah, I've wrestled with this a lot. I talked earlier about, you know, having caution about confusing standards with curriculum. I do think that a lot of times it's the responsibility of the curriculum writers in the school to design those thematic approaches, but at the same time, I'm very mindful of the fact that not every LEA and organization has the resources and human capital to do that effectively, and it would be a real disservice if not every student in Washington, D.C. is able to see some of the larger trends and themes that Ms. McCrea just spoke to. That's where I think a curriculum can come into use, by being organized around these ideas and providing like a roadmap or a guide for schools to utilize when creating their curriculum, of how you can return to these themes constantly.
I'd also just try to incorporate character development as one aspect of the learning as well. So just starting to weave in service, character development through looking at, you know, historical individuals that have modeled that.
Thank you so much. President Wattenberg.
I'm the last one in this lineup, and I just wonder, are you all available to stay for another round? And would people be interested in having another round of, yeah. Are you available to do that? Okay, all right. So that's a warning. Okay. So I just want to raise a couple of general comments, and then go into some specifics. Just in terms of this question of how do you focus on both individual groups and the broader group, one of the sort of themes that I've been reading a lot about, and you probably have been too, that I think is really beautifully stated, is the idea that social studies and history needs to be windows and mirrors, that it's both giving our kids the opportunity to look out to the things in the worlds that they don't know about and to see themselves doing things that are important. So I just loved that when I first heard it, so I throw that out. I want to talk structurally maybe about, two of you are from charter groups and you're from DCPS, and I know, so DCPS recently has sort of doubled down on the importance of teaching social studies for a minimum amount of time in the early grades, which some people had sort of lost sight of because there was so much attention on the reading and math tests. I'm curious, in your schools, and to the extent that you know more broadly in the charter world, to what extent is social studies focused on in the early grades? To what extent does it get squeezed out because of attention to reading and math because of the testing, or any other reason? So that's my first question, especially to you two.
Yeah, I can speak pretty well to that. So I'm very happy that the organization I work for has made a real commitment in the last couple of years towards teaching social studies with more time allotted than it has the past previous years. I think that on one hand, if we want to be very optimistic about it, we can just say there's an acknowledgement in education right now in a lot of LEAs that we probably tacked way too hard for the math ELA focus. If we want to be more cynical, I would say that current events have really convinced adults in education that it's real important to teach kids social studies and facts matter, so our organization has definitely embraced that. But I think also, secondly, a lot of organizations and studies are demonstrating how important it is, even if we want to talk about the big test, to teach science and social studies, that kids cannot effectively do well on informational text if they don't have a strong background in it. So I know that our organization and others have recommitted for reasons like that as well.
I'll probably come back to this on my second round, but
Our at Center City, we have a humanities block. So our time is spent pretty much in a co-teacher environment where we spend a large period of time where we cover multiple subjects. And so typically what we like to do is really start with social studies. So typically almost lead in with social studies to begin the day and then venture into our other content areas.
Thank you.
Round two, Dr. Sutter?
So one of my questions was actually the same as Ms. Wattenberg, so I'm going to let her come back to that in her second round if she likes. I wanted to ask two questions about how we involve educators in the process and then how we equip and protect educators as we embark on this new world of standards that you all are suggesting. So the first is, we are obviously soliciting public comment, but we also want to make sure that we involve educators throughout the process. So I'd love to hear from you on how we can best do that. Second, I had the joy of attending a DCPS professional development session for the start of this school year, and it was a high school teacher session in which a number of teachers expressed concern over how to grapple with the kind of complexity you all are talking about our students needing as we talk about perspectives in history, as we talk about culturally relevant topics, while being protected from saying the wrong thing or having students or parents say, I don't like what happened in class today. How do we approach that as well, both in working with our educators on writing the standards, but also in the kind of things we do as a rollout of new standards?
Those are definitely interesting questions. I don't know that I
Again, I'm coming in with the easy ones.
don't know that I have a response for you, but I'm definitely looking forward to talking with you more about that and engaging our team more around those questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of these, I'll take the second question first. In terms of the more controversial aspect, I think we could probably simplify and call it, right? I think that it comes down to the idea of establishing clear norms within not only the standards themselves about the approach that they're taking and the intentionality behind it and the rationale that will serve as a guide for schools to follow and implement. Then it also comes down to the responsibility of any organization when they're teaching any topic that has the potential to divide or raise controversy within students and families, to be very clear and intentional with teachers about ways to go about doing that, that does not impose a certain mandate or point of view, but allows for a healthy and spirited discussion.
Just thinking of examples, the idea of using restorative circles, so, beginning discussions already in a circle where everybody gets the opportunity to share their thoughts and their perspectives on that topic. And then just obviously giving students the opportunity to share their feelings. I feel like a lot of times students, we look for knowledge, but we also don't look for emotion until we get the bad emotions out of students. So actually getting students to share how they feel about a topic, possibly beforehand or even as while we're learning.
Do we want to address Ms. Sutter's first point as well?
Teacher, or yeah. No, I was thinking because having friends that are teachers as well, I almost wanted to call them like, yo, what do you want me to say tonight? Like, like I'm in front of the board, oh my gosh. So really just giving those, opportunities for teacher voice. So, open discussions, open calls, just, open invites. I think I was just invited, in a sense, from, someone in our head department. So just really just giving those opportunities to teachers.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Parker?
Thank you all. Several of my colleagues and I recently read Natalie Wexler's book, The Knowledge Gap, where she talks about the importance of social studies, but I think underneath that is this idea that kids do better when they learn more of the same stuff, right? There's also ample research that talks about very similar things that like the baseball study, that as kids are learning or know more about a topic, they do better. So in that spirit, I think revamping our social studies standards is one piece of the ingredient and is the what, but I think there's still room for us to discuss and revisit the how, and like how are schools grappling with social studies content, and namely how that content is being wedded with other content, i.e. ELA, math, etc. So my question is, what either curricula are you using that you find is doing a good job of blending social studies with other academic areas, and or how are your schools, and within DCPS maybe there are specific examples, how are your individual schools doing at making that blend, if that makes sense? Because quite frankly, 45 minutes, if we spend millions of dollars and years, and kids are getting, let's say, 2 days of 45-minute blocks, that just doesn't seem like a great trade-off. And so I think it's beneficial for us to think about how do we ensure that there is a more common understanding of the value of social studies. So curriculum, but also ensuring that maybe learning across content areas is happening.
So to speak to some examples, you asked about any preferred curriculum, right? As I referenced earlier, we are currently looking towards New York as a guide, which was revised largely with C3 in mind, right? It pretty much follows to the point of letter almost all of their recommendations that are prescribed in C3. In terms of integrating, I think that it's the goal of schools to develop a more project-based learning approach. I know that both of our high schools currently are doing so, and that has involved coordination between myself and the content directors for science, ELAs primarily right now, in terms of designing projects in units that can incorporate aspects of both. So like at one of our upcoming teacher meetings, we are meeting as both a science and social studies cohort to go over curriculum and units around the topic of climate change.
We currently use Wit and Wisdom, and so we supplemented our novel-based study. So currently, like in 7th grade, we're reading The Midwife's Apprentice, and we'll supplement it with additional information on that content area. So, you know, medieval times and all of the additional work that's related to that content area. So it relates both with what they're getting in the literature from both the novel study, but also giving the factual information as well. We do a block system, so yes.
And then in DCPS, our curriculum is primarily teacher written and reviewed in partnership with our central office team. And so we've also worked with other central office teams and their teacher curriculum writers to ensure some cross-curricular connections when those opportunities are available. That's just off the top of my head where we are.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Ms. Williams?
First of all, I want to thank you all for staying here with us tonight and answering our questions. But again, I want to ask DCPS again, because there are so many different ethnic groups in the District of Columbia with different skills, different grade levels. How do you incorporate curriculum that can meet these very, very diverse needs? I mean, I just can't envision right now how you can even begin to do that. So I'm not saying that you have to dive deep into it, but what is your goal? What are your goals to be able to accomplish this at some point?
Sure. So I think that's a really great question. I want to also defer back to what Mr. Stevens has said about curriculum not being the same as standards. So we first need the foundations of standards in order to then revisit the curriculum that we currently have. We do not have full-blown lesson plans available for every single standard in 180 days worth of curriculum in DCPS for social studies. So there is that flexibility still with with teachers, and our team works through principals and through our professional development and just visiting schools and working with individual teachers to really help them make the right instructional decisions with our curriculum for their students.
So what you're saying is, depending on the school and the needs of the students, they can help develop the curriculum for that particular group of DCPS students?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, I'd like to give a plug for restorative circles. I think that if all classrooms had restorative circles before they started working, that they'd see a tremendous jump in what's going on in the classroom. I'd also like, I don't know much about history, I just stole that, but I do know a little bit. But I also know that a lot of the complaints always were that I'm talking about U.S. history, and that U.S. history never got to the middle of the 20th century. Has there ever been, this is just a question, has there ever been a thought to teach history backwards?
I mean, that's like the classic barstool nerd debate amongst history. Yes, yes.
I don't drink, so I don't know about that.
But I mean, yes, like you raised right, like a great point. I like to show my teachers a classic episode of The Simpsons, of course, where it's the scene on the last day of school and the kids are marching out, and the teacher comes out and he's like, "Wait a second, we never discussed World War II." And the kids freeze, and he's like, "We won!" And then the kids like happily cheer out the building, shouting USA to start their summer vacation. But to go to your question, I think, yes, there has been that discussion. I think for a lot of reasons it's usually dismissed because there's no context to establish off of. But to the larger issue, that again gets to the ideas of the importance of big key ideas and enduring understandings to not gloss over early U.S. history, but not get so bogged down in it.
I'm just wondering about it because I was an English teacher. I still am an English teacher, and teaching literature, which is what I did, is all about allusions, and it's all about, especially about historical allusions. And you can't get the poem, or you can't get the novel, or you can't get the short story if you don't understand history. And that's a huge problem for us as English teachers, is that the kids don't know much about history. And I'm just thinking that, I mean, we're living in a time where history is being made like by the millisecond, and yet students don't read the newspaper. God knows they shouldn't watch the news on TV. And how can we get students interested in because it's all, it repeats itself. I just made that up, all right? And so it's not anything new. There's nothing new happening. So why can't it go backwards?
Well, I would say this. I think what the more important question is, and I'll use an analogy, an example, as an English teacher.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you. If you could use the mic for the TV, thanks.
I use an example for you as an English teacher I think you could relate to. It is impossible to teach every vocabulary word to your students over the course of a year, right? Like, that's not going to happen. So what do? Well, you teach kids how to develop context clues and other such skills to establish it, right? No history teacher is ever going to be able to teach their kids all of the content. But in some sense, history is really easy, right? All I do is I read the New York Times, and I suddenly know a lot about history after one day. So I think that this important piece comes into designing kids to be interested in history, or designing standards and curriculum that make kids interested in history, and then that give them the skills to access it. So that even if I haven't learned everything I need to know about World War I when we're reading All Quiet on the Western Front, even if we haven't gotten there yet in the course, I have the ability to frame what's happening in the novel and possibly even research some on my own, right? So I think we often make a mistake of getting too bogged down in how do we perfectly line up all of the things that kids need to know and address them at all points in time. Well, the answer is very complicated, but also very simple.
Thank you.
Dr. Gasoi?
Hello again. So given that, as you pointed out, now I'm really bad with names, I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens, the three main areas of dissatisfaction from the survey, and then, you, Mr. Clemons, thank you. pointed out some really specific areas that you think should be included. So can you each just say, what would this look like? Like, can you just give us a sense of what would make teachers answer differently to this survey? Like, what would make more of them satisfied? Or what would it look like if we had standards that did encourage more use of technology, for instance, or place-based and project-based? I know that's curriculum, but still, but you brought it up. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. What would it look like, broadly?
I think that it would look like teachers feeling that the standards give them a guide as to what needs to be taught over the course of not just a single year, but over an entire K-12 experience. And they can see a logical narrative play out as a student progresses vertically. And then I think that within that year, a teacher would feel a nice three bears approach, to the coverage aspect, right? They're not lost, they're not completely in the dark over like, oh my God, what do I teach, right? They have standards that clearly spell that out to them, but they are also written in such a way that gives the teacher the freedom and the creativity they need to design a course and lessons that are creative, thought-provoking, and engaging. I think that if teachers felt that, then they would respond very positively.
What is it about the standards now that prevent them from doing that? Is it the, yeah.
I was actually going to say this in response to your first question, but right now, how the standards are written, a lot of them have these parentheses with lists and footnotes and paragraphs of just very specific people and places and events to cover that sometimes don't have a lot to do with each other. So it makes it very hard for a teacher to actually meet that standard, or for those students to demonstrate mastery on that standard if they don't get to every single inventor listed in the scientific revolution, for example. So I think that's kind of a good example of where this balance between breadth and depth really lives. That is, teachers are trying to cover all of that rather than go into the significance of that overall concept.
I'd additionally look into possibly having focusing tasks, so just a task or an activity or a focusing topic that the teachers know that is possibly the priority or the focus.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you. I was talking to Dr. Sutter a couple weeks past about an excerpt I read from Trevor Noah's Born a Crime book, and he's illustrating how the story of African Americans through our history textbooks are portrayed. And he says, we learn about slavery, we learn about Jim Crow, then we learn about Martin Luther King or the Civil Rights era. And it struck me then how accurate that statement was. And the thing that's very dangerous about the way our history textbooks teach that is it would lead us to assume that racism ended with the Civil Rights era, and that systematic racism, effects of systematic racism ended then. But there are issues today that we don't talk about, or our history textbooks don't talk about, that have been in use for decades now. The war on drugs, redlining, police brutality, segregation in our schools today, and inequity among specifically African Americans in education. And I just wanted to ask you all, what can be done to discuss these issues, not just issues of the past, but issues that are affecting millions of people right now? Because when our history textbooks aren't covering something, I think for the most part, we are less likely to recognize that and deem it as legitimate. And I think that's very dangerous, because these are things that are keeping and that have kept Black people oppressed in this nation for too long.
First of all, I want to say thank you for that very articulate statement. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about too, what Ms. Williams said about how different people are presented to different groups. It's not just about how African American students are seeing African Americans in history, it's about how all students are seeing various groups throughout history, and to make sure that the positive contributions and not just the negative impact of other people and white people have been on these groups. It's about what the contributions throughout history have been, and also the actions that have been taken. So really, and going back to the tokenism approach too, it's not just about you know, the one significant person and distilling it down to that one thing that's safe to talk about, but really exploring the larger issues so that all students can see how all groups wove the fabric of history together.
I mean, I think the only thing that I would add on to that would just be that's again the responsibility of the people who contribute to the process of writing the DC, or revising, I should say, the DC standards, right? That you are going to get a group full of educators and curriculum writers and whatever, and ensuring that all of them fulfill their responsibility of teaching history accurately and fairly, not just the example you raised that magically everything was great in America's civil rights after 1968. Right? Like, that's a very precise and very real example, but there are so many others too that we have to ensure the standards reflect accurately.
Finally, additionally, just continuing to have student voice. I feel as though you have an opportunity to be where you're at. It gives a true light to exactly what we should do more of, which is give students the opportunity to express how they feel both in the classroom, outside of the classroom, but I feel even as I think you said, Mr. O'Leary, in regards to them making the history now. So if you're writing your story now, if you're telling your truth now, that's going in the history book. And if you don't write it or if you don't put it down on paper, you know, many of us then forget it or it's lost to history.
Mr. Jacobson.
Not to put him on the spot, but if Mr. O'Sullivan has any additional questions or statements, I'd be happy to yield my time. You're okay? Then I yield back.
Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you. So I know we talked a lot about kind of the distinction between curriculum and the standards, but I think to my colleague Mr. O'Sullivan's point, right, there are critical pieces of information, critical concepts that I think as a city we prioritize. We need all of our students to learn, and in such a diverse, I think, education landscape, you know, with such a large number of LEAs. Anecdotally, can you, I guess, give your thoughts about how we strike the right balance in terms of being prescriptive enough to make sure that from an equity lens, all of our students are really getting this critical information across LEAs, while also not necessarily tying down the hands of our LEAs to innovate and really mold the curriculum in the best way for their students?
From my perspective, I think that's a question that can be best answered by the people that would be working on these standards and ensuring that, again, they have diverse range of experiences and perspectives and backgrounds that they're bringing to the table when they're writing these standards or rewriting these standards is going to be really important.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that also in looking to organizations like National
Sorry, microphone. Thank you.
Also, in terms of looking to organizations like National Council of Social Studies, which not only designed C3, of course, but has a very clear thematic approach to social studies, using those resources to the parties that will be responsible for writing the curriculum would be crucial.
President Wattenberg.
Thanks. I wanted to give you a chance, especially Mr. Stevens, but others as well, to talk about the problems with sequencing that you raised in your very first comment, and I think others may have mentioned that as well. And I want to connect it, actually, I want to follow up on something Mr. Parker said, which is part of learning stuff is to have it repeated in a cumulative way, so you don't want it to be scattered, so tying that to your concern at the beginning that stuff wasn't always sequenced well, so examples.
Yeah, so I briefly inserted some examples, right, from DCSS of how teachers feel it's jumping all over the place, where you might teach something and then return to it 3 years later. A number of states right now have organized their curriculum to do exactly what you just established, which is to establish strong foundations at the middle school level, which can then be reinforced in more of a survey aspect of courses at the high school level. Also, at the same time, of course, using elementary school to not only give kids a foundational knowledge of just basic content, but to start teaching social studies skills. So to illustrate that, a lot of states are moving towards an approach now where 5th through 8th grade, you would do an early world history approach, and you would devote one entire course to an Eastern Hemisphere to avoid that Eurocentric problem that we've talked so much about. Then you could devote another year to a Western Hemisphere approach. those kids are now going to enter high school where they would take their World I and their World II classes with so much more knowledge than a lot of DC students do. Same idea applies to U.S. history. A lot of schools are doing, or states are doing an approach where 7th grade would be U.S. history 1, 8th grade would be U.S. history 2. To again use the DC example, when students would now enter 11th or 12th grade for U.S. history, it could be a broad survey course where there's some background knowledge, and that would serve students so well for government and economics in 12th grade. So I know that was like a really specific example, but I think that those are ways that you can have a natural logical sequencing that would support student learning.
Specifically, you're talking about in terms of course sequencing.
Correct.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
is that really okay?
Yeah. Just again, the idea of like looking at a very clear K-12 story that anyone who doesn't even have a strong background in social studies could look at it and say, "Oh, that makes sense. That's going to tell a clear narrative for kids." Which, and I would also say we've talked a lot about LEAs, right? Charter, DCPS. As we of course know, students move between charters and DCPS. Having commonality around that would be something I think the people at the table here right now would certainly appreciate.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that because this issue of how specific and the breadth and the flexibility, there is this tension with this very transient system we have and people going back and forth, and we really have to, I think, figure out how to, more than other places really, to be clear about what really does need to be taught and sequence it while creating some flexibility in there. So anyway.
You know, I would focus in on foundational skills, so stuff that just has to be a foundation from either grade band, like he said, where it's you know, K through 5, 6 through 8, high school, and almost mandatory that you begin the year just re-emphasizing going over those foundational skills that kind of get you started for the rest of the subject for that year, possibly.
I agree with my colleague.
Okay. All right, well, that was terrific. The beginning of what's going to be a very long conversation. Jessica, would you like to close it with any comments?
Yeah, I think that just the last thing I'll say, and I think I am perhaps more optimistic than my colleagues on this, having worked in and with a number of our charter LEAs, that I think there is a real concern over how we invest in this process to make sure that it is useful for every LEA in the city, and that it incorporates as many LEAs in the process as possible. Because my hunch is that if teachers from many LEAs are included in the writing of the standards, many LEAs will be inclined to use the standards. My other hunch is that we could learn a lot about how to think about the rollout of new standards, including creation of curriculum, creation of professional development, by allowing the people who write the standards, say the teachers, to be incorporated in the creation of the curriculum and the professional development, and that might be easier to do statewide if it's all one big, long, collective process. So I'm an optimist at heart, but I'm also a deep believer that if we involve educators from the start in this, that they're going to help us drive this process and say, this is best for us and our students, and it's going to be far more powerful than our voice on it could ever be. So thank you for being part of this tonight and for helping us kick this off.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, board members, we are almost done. We have a couple reports to adopt, and I believe that is it. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, the Ombudsman's office provides independent and neutral conflict resolution and mediation services to all district residents. Their annual report provides recommendations based on their work. Is there a motion to adopt the annual report of the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education? And let me just say one thing before asking for the motion, which is, as with all of our reports, we're adopting it for the record. It's not to say that we agree or disagree with any part of it. We're adopting it for the record, and there is a lot of interest in having discussions as we go forward about how we can put into effect, bring about some of the goals that are talked about in these reports. So with that, is there a motion to adopt the annual report of the Ombudsman?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on the report?
Madam President, I would just say, as I've gone to community meetings in Ward 5, several neighbors have expressed their appreciation for the work of our student advocate and ombudsman's office. So I am delighted to accept this annual report that I think speaks to many of the needs that our parents and neighbors have as it relates to special education, bullying, transportation, inroads to our school communities, but also just want to express my deepest appreciation to our sister office and all of our colleagues in that office for the hard work that they do every day.
Thank you, and agreed. Dr. Sutter?
I'll echo everything my colleague Mr. Parker said and add, I think that in particular the recommendations of the Ombudsman on special education have the potential to start a really important statewide conversation around how we consider ways to improve opportunities and outcomes for our students with special needs, and I urge anyone who has not yet read this report and its recommendations to do so.
I urge that as well, and I think you're speaking about two things. One is the manifest, the determination, and also the framework for the response to intervention.
That, as well as the consideration of how we provide additional information to families about the services offered at all LEAs to serve students with disabilities. It's a complicated issue with a lot of legal hurdles, but I think one that many, many city families have sought after solutions to. That came up at a panel on the My School DC lottery as well this week, that families of students with disabilities want to understand what schools not only are legally required to serve their students, but are excited and willing to do it well. And I think there's some interesting ideas in this report about that.
Agreed. And anybody who's interested in this, I do recommend the report highly. Okay, other comments? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed? Okay, secondly, we have the Office of the Student Advocates report. The Student Advocates has a proactive approach to public education, which has helped hundreds of district families each year navigate the complicated education landscape in the district. Their annual report provides recommendations on some of these same issues as well as many others. Is there a motion to adopt the annual report of the Office of the Student Advocate?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on the adoption of this report? Well, let me just echo, okay.
Madam President, I will just echo the appreciation for our other sister office, the Student Advocate, or the Office of the Student Advocate, for their hard work, and not just increasing the number of calls that are coming into the office, which by extension means more parents and families know resources available to them, but increasing the satisfaction and the completion rate of those calls. And so just wanting to echo our appreciation for their hard work.
Mr. Batchelor?
Madam President, thank you. And I also want to commend the Office on the Student of the Student Advocate for really, I think, becoming the center of leadership in terms of our efforts, our citywide efforts around safe passage in our city. They've done tremendous work in not just advancing solutions to keep our students safe, but also building the human capital in our communities to really make it a lasting effort. And so I for sure want to thank them for their work specifically on this issue and clearly tons of other issues that impact our students and families. So thank you.
Thank you. And I would just like to also acknowledge that in both offices we have new leadership. Serena Hayes is the Chief Ombudsman, and Dan Davis is leading the Office of the Student Advocate. And again, very interesting reports, very interesting findings about what goes on in our schools, very interesting recommendations. And if you're watching, these are the offices you can go to if you're having issues in your school. They can help you with mediation. They can also bring resources together to educate parents in your schools about how to mobilize on behalf of important issues. So with that, all in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, new business. Members, any announcements, comments you would like to make before we adjourn?
I feel like I've been very talkative tonight. Tomorrow night in Ward 6, we're having a public safety meeting. Charles Allen's office is hosting it, but we'll be having a roundtable discussion after an initial panel about safe passage. The Student Advocate's office will be joining me for that roundtable discussion. So if you are in Ward 6 and are watching, please feel free to come to the meeting. It's at Watkins Elementary tomorrow night at 6:30. If any of my colleagues are interested in joining me, I'd be delighted to see you there as well.
Any other comments? Okay, seeing none with no further business, I would entertain It's 7:44, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thanks again to our speakers. The ayes have it, and this public meeting of the DC State Board of Education is adjourned at 7:44.